Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Our group is going to present a topic about the causes and consequences of Japan asset bubble in 1989 and a comparison of the crisis with the credit crisis in 2008. I would like to hand over your time to Fiona to talk about the background.
For the 1989 Japan bubble, Japan was famous for improved things and selling Western products for cheaper price, as well as inventing innovative products and export them at that time. The export miracle led to overconfidence and overexuberance in Japan's economy. Japan's booming post-war export economy and strict fiscal policies that were meant to encourage household savings resulted in a cash surplus in the country's banking system that eventually led to more lenient lending. The Plaza Accord in 1985, which intended to alleviate the problem of exorbitant US dollar currency exchange rate, caused the yen currency to appreciate against other currencies. Japan government issued quantitative easing to compensate the loss of the export industry. As interest rate has been lowered down, excess liquidity in the banking system emerged. Foreign investors invest in Japanese yen. Then, for the 2008 credit crisis, in US, it was expected home value would keep on rising, so people borrowed a large sum of money and expected that they could easily pay back when the housing price rose in the future. Mortgage lenders did not have careful examination of the borrower's ability to pay back before approving the loans. This gave rise to subprime lending and adjustable rate mortgages. With the deregulation of the government policies in the 1970s and new financial tools like mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations, more investors around the world were attracted to invest in the housing market of the US. In both cases, there was influx of large amounts of foreign capital into the domestic countries. However, the Japanese case, unlike the US, did not have the complicated innovative financial products like the MBS and the CDO. I will now hand over the time to Ronald to talk about the causes of the bubbles.
Thank you, Fiona. In the following, I am going to introduce some of the main causes of the 1989 Japan bubble. As expected, being one of the most well-known crises of the time, the causes are multidimensional. They involve different stakeholders and are generally complex and correlated. First of all, it was the aggressive behaviors of financial institutions, in particular, banks. According to a journal article in 2001 about Japan's asset bubble and monetary policy, this cause was based on two phenomena at that time: the deregulation of financial system and the lower profitability of banks. Due to the deregulation, there was a reduced restriction on the entrance of the security markets by financial institutions to raise funds since 1980. Firms no longer needed to rely on banks' loans that much. This reduced the profitability of black banks as the demand for their loans decreased. The deregulation of interest rates then encouraged banks to loan out heavily to property-backed businesses instead. This stimulated the property bubble in 1989. The second cause was the government's long-lasting quantitative easing. QE led to three effects. Firstly, it increased money supply, thus lowering interest rates. This reduced the cost of borrowing for financial institutions to invest. Secondly, QE supported a boom in the stock market. This reduced the capital cost for firms to raise funds, such as by issuing shares. Thirdly, QE led to an increase in asset prices, which boosted the value of land and stocks held by firms. If firms increased the collateral value of its assets, they will be able to raise a lot of funds to invest. We can see from this diagram that the asset prices held by the firms actually rocketed in 1989, which provided them the incentive to invest further. This showed QE encouraged investing activities, both in property and capital markets, thus stimulating the bubble. The third cause was biased taxation by the government, which encouraged speculation and investment. Based on the journal article in 2001 that I mentioned before, and another article in 1993 about asset prices in Japan, Japan's tax structure at that time led to low cost for holding land and high cost for selling land. As a consequence, firms owning the land would prefer to delay the sales of land to avoid profit reductions due to the taxation policy. Supply of land decreased while demand for land increased. The overall effect was a rocketing market price for properties. One point to add was that the agricultural areas were expected to be converted into residential land for sale in order to meet the growing demand for properties. This has further pushed up property prices due to future expectations. Nevertheless, as mentioned before, supply of land did not increase that much as anticipated due to tax controls. This exacerbated the problem of biased taxation. Last but not least, the fourth cause of the Japan bubble was overconfidence and euphoria in society. As a matter of fact, Japan has faced recession in our economy since 1974, all the way till 1986. However, in early 1986, Japan showed a sign of recovery, supported by growth in GDP and rising corporate revenues. Cost of borrowing fell and asset prices rose as a result of the government's quantitative easing policy. The optimists believed a new economic era had arrived, and this was a result of successful long-term financial liberalization instead of short-term consequences of the QE. Secondly, Japan's importance in the international financial market was increasing at that time. For instance, it was common to see there was takeover of foreign firms by Japanese firms, and Japan itself was the biggest creditor country in the world. All of these added on to the overconfidence to the Japanese economic performance. People tend to blindly follow what others perceived and tended to overlook the risk of investing. This further pushed up asset prices and stock prices to a historically high level until the bubble burst. Moving on, we shall have Fiona to continue on the comparison of the causes in the two crises.
Thank you, Ronald. The first similarity is that lowered interest rates encouraged speculative activities. It was believed that the root cause of the 2008 credit crisis was a saving gluts in the countries like China, Japan, and Germany, where there is a net flow of capital from the abroad to the US financial market. This lowered the long-term interest rates and raised the excess prices in the US. This encouraged further speculations, since the cost of borrowing money to invest is lower. The investors were no longer satisfied with their investment in the plain vanilla securities guaranteed by the government-sponsored enterprises with low risk and low returns. The investors then turned to the private label mortgage-based securities issued by large investment firms, which is one of the main causes of the crisis. Similarly, the root cause of the 1989 Japan bubble was believed to be the long-term quantitative easing policy by the Japanese government. By lowering the interest rates, it increased the real value of the assets held by financial institutions and provided a lower cost of raising funds for investment purposes. This encouraged speculations in the property market, which is similar to the 2008 case. The second similarity is the insufficient risk management. Regarding the 2008 credit crisis, one cause was lack of adequate risk management. Firstly, the investment banks started to accept subprime mortgages to maintain their high profits. Those borrowers were generally with less credit, but they could borrow money even with no down payment and no proof of income. The overall effect was the risk of giving out loans increased, but no one seemed to care about it when they had earning huge money from it. Finally, more and more low-quality borrowers defaulted, affecting the good quality buyers to default as well. This caused the asset prices to plummet and started the chain effect of the crisis. Moreover, the methods used by the investors to hedge their risk were not appropriate. The use of credit default swaps was basically unregulated and opaque, and it represented unsustainable capitalism. For example, the market did not have a central clearinghouse. Lehman Brothers was a large investor in CDS, but the public was not notified of who and by what amount CDS had been traded with firm. However, it was largely used by the American International Group for risk hedging purposes. This was similar to the case of the Japan bubble in 1989. It could be reflected by the aggressive behavior of financial institutions, as productivity of banks was reduced. In order to maintain their competitiveness, they loaned out heavily to property-based backed businesses. However, they disregarded the bubble formed in the property market, and there was insufficient risk assessment and management. This stimulated the property bubble in 1989. Then I'll pass the time to Yuki to talk about the consequences of both bubbles.
As the asset bubble burst in 1989, Japan was under a great recession. The period from 1991 to 2000 was known as the lost decade. The Bank of Japan tightened monetary policy so as to suppress the rising asset price. This marked the outbreak of the crisis. As the cost of borrowing increased because the contractionary monetary policy carried out by the Bank of Japan increased the interest rate. Nikkei stock price has decreased by almost in half from 39,000 to 20,000 in 1990 and dropped to around 15,000 in 1992. The sharp drop in stock price led to the burst of real estate bubble in Japan. The major 6 cities' average land prices had decreased by 15.5% from the highest price. A decrease in asset price will lead to a decrease in wealth of general public. People were not confident with the future prospects of Japan and they are less willing to consume and invest. As a result, Japanese firms has lost their competitive edges against the counterparts. For example, China and South Korea. Exports of Japan was hampered. This hindered the economic growth of Japan. The drastic decrease in asset price also created liquidity problems to banks and firms, which is also called the balance sheet recession. As the asset price dropped, people and corporates that had invested in real estate could not repay the loans. Even if the bank collected the real estate from the borrowers as collateral, it was not enough to pay off the debt as the asset value decreases. Furthermore, banks were less willing to lend money due to the insolvency problem. It was more difficult for firms and banks to borrow money. Many of these banks and firms become so big companies that requires government bailouts so as to survive. However, these government subsidies were not effective in boosting Japanese economy. Taking 1990 as the base year, real GNP per working age population decreased from 100 to around 85 and the growth of GNP has declined to 0.7% per year in the last decade. It shows that Japan was suffering from a decade of economic recession. I will now talk about the comparison of consequences between the two crises. In terms of asset price, both crises involved a rapid decline in real estate prices. In the credit crisis in 2008, the home price index rapidly decreases from 200 to nearly 150. In Japan asset bubble in 1989, the real estate price also plunged during the crisis. Property price has 17.9% drop in residential sector, 13.1% in industrial sector, and 15.2% in commercial sector. The first similarity of the consequences is the drop in asset price. The decline in asset price led to a balance sheet recession in both countries involved in these two crises. For individuals, both crises led to a negative wealth effect. In credit crisis in 2008, U.S. was suffering from diminishing wealth. The estimated loss of wealth in U.S. was around $3 trillion. In Japan asset bubble in 1987, the wealth of people decreased due to the decrease in the value of the asset. As a result, people in these two crises reduced their consumption and investment because they lacked the confidence of future prospects and purchasing power. This further worsened the economy of both affected countries. The similarity of the consequences is a decrease in consumption and investment due to the declining wealth of people. I will now hand over time to Wayne to further elaborate.
Thank you, Yuki. For banks and corporates, both crises led to insolvency problems. In credit crisis in 2008, the decline of the housing market in the US made subprime borrowers difficult to make repayments because the decrease in asset price caused the resale of their properties harder. The firms and banks were in high debt ratio. The debt of financial sector was equal to 116% of GDP in 2007 in the US. Banks would collect and sell properties from collateral in order to pay off the debt. Nearly 1.3 million of houses were under foreclosure, which accounted for 75% of the last year. Due to the liquidity problem and a decrease in asset value, banks were unwilling to lend money to other banks and firms. This increased difficulties to borrowing money and they had to seek other ways to finance themselves. Same for Japan asset bubbles in 1989. Banks and firms suffer from liquidity problems due to the balance sheet recession and the difficulty in obtaining bank loans. Therefore, one of the similarities of the two crises is the insolvency of banks and firms. Furthermore, government bailouts were also involved after the outbreak of the two crises. In credit crisis in 2008, the US government has provided subsidies to save financial institutions that face danger of bankruptcy. For example, US government took over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The Federal Reserve also offered an $85 billion loan to ARG. In Japan asset bubble in 1989, the Japanese government provided subsidies to zombie companies which are failed banks and firms. Therefore, credit crisis in 2008 and Japan asset bubbles in 1989 are similar in terms of government bailout. One of the main differences between the two crises will be the area affected. While mainly Japan suffered from the asset bubble in 1989, the credit crisis in 2008 has brought substantial economic loss in a global scale. Even so, both crises taught him a lesson. Governments and economists are striving to forecast and prevent the next financial crisis. For instance, Japan, which has implemented QE for a long time, evaluates from time to time about its QE policy. Here is the reference list. Thank you.